and I know she'd have a wonderful time. Seeing some decent shows, I mean, not just movies. Well, I had in mind...
Stella Dallas is a 1937 film directed by King Vidor. It is the story of a working-class woman with dreams of class passing. She marries a wealthy man, but is never able to fully take on the role of the upper-class woman as she had hoped. Although Stella is never able to fully class pass, we see her daughter Laurel realize her mother's fantasy for herself. The film is consistently self-referential, speaking about the role cinema plays in society, having the power to create an often unrealistic fantasy. In the clip shown previously, we hear Stella comparing cinema to theater, explicitly labeling film viewing as being lower or middle class. Let's hear it again.
And I know she'd have a wonderful time. Seeing some decent shows, I mean, not just movies. Well, I had in mind...
Here, the film is directly addressing its viewers. It assumes the viewer's class status based on the fact that they are watching this movie, rather than going to the theater per se, which would be considered more upper class according to the film. In doing this, Stella Dallas evokes class consciousness, guiding its audience to consider their position in society and how going to the movies addresses and questions that. In her 2006 essay, Performing Modernity and Gender in the 1930s, published in Cinema and Modernity, Gwendolyn Audrey Foster discusses how film is unique in its relationship with viewers of varying classes. She refers to the Motion Picture Production Code, which considers this in their section about cinema's moral obligations, comparing cinema to other art forms such as music, literature, and drama, as Stella Dallas did in this clip. It describes cinema as being uniquely able to reach every class, not just what it considers the mature. This is achieved both through being a multisensory form of entertainment and through its vast reproducibility. At the root of cinema, then, is its relationship with the lower and middle classes. Let's now watch another clip from Stella Dallas to further explore this argument. Here, Stella is on her first date with Stephen at the movies. Instead of seeing the movie screen from a low angle or an over-the-shoulder shot which would assign the image to a specific character's point of view, we see it in a high-angle long shot. This lack of suture in this moment leaves the viewer to then see this shot from their own personal perspective, rather than from Stella's or any other character's. This effect pulls the viewer out of the narrative for a moment, encouraging a level of self-awareness. This perspective shift works together with the content of this shot, depicting an audience watching a movie, which mirrors the viewer's own situation, being an audience member at the movies themselves. Through these cinematic devices, the audience is led to consider their role as a moviegoer. The content of the movie shown on this screen is also relevant and will be brought up later. By following that image with this shot of Stella watching the movie playing on screen, the viewer is encouraged to identify with Stella, as Stella and the audience of this film are both moviegoers looking up at a screen in a movie theater. Here we see Stella completely entranced by the movie. Her face is physically illuminated by the movie screen. When Stephen turns to watch Stella as she watches the movie, the viewer is led to consider how they look, themselves, as they watch the movie, imagining that Stephen is watching them as well. In addition, Stephen's glance feels a bit condescending. He seems to find it endearing how engrossed Stella is in the film. He doesn't fall trapped to the film's trance-like quality like Stella does. Stephen's somewhat patronizing perception of Stella in this moment, and the difference in their dispositions, is easily attributed to their varying class backgrounds. We see here how different movie watching is for people of different classes. While movie watching in general has already been labeled as being a lower form of entertainment, as we discussed earlier, the movie that Stella and Stephen are watching also explicitly depicts an upper-class gathering, including women in elaborate gowns and men in tuxedos. Stella, a working-class woman, is shown almost hypnotized by the affluence shown on screen. Stella's fantasy of having an upper-class lifestyle is physically shown on the movie screen in front of her. creating the sense that the movie screen is a sort of window to a desired reality, specifically for class passing. Unfortunately for Stella, this fantasy is never attained for herself, but it is for her daughter Laurel. Next, let's look at a sequence in which Laurel plays ping pong and attends an upper-class party at the home of her father's soon-to-be wife, Helen. We can see in this moment how comfortable Laurel looks in this upper-class environment, both through her demeanor and by the way she's dressed. She does not look out of place. There is a sense of detachment here between the viewer and the action. Although the camera is moving into the action, it does not give the feeling that the audience is invited into the moment. Because of the lack of suture, the viewer is not identified with any character in the scene. They are not invited into this upper-class scenario. They are forced to remain a spectator, watching from their seat in the movie theater, as Stella did in the scene shown previously. With this crossfade, a new image is created of Laurel looking downward onto the next scene. This superimposition indicates that this next sequence depicts Laurel's fantasy, fancy dresses and upscale parties. Though in contrast to the visualization of Stella's fantasy shown previously in the movie theater, Laurel exists within her own fantasy. She is seen dancing in the party herself. As we move into the next portion of this scene, I will display it alongside a shot from the previous scene we discussed. The two shots are framed almost identically, long, high-angle shots with couples dancing and a chandelier hanging above them. Even as one moves in closer, the other does as well. This distinct similarity between the movie that Stella watches and the scene of Laurel dancing at the party directly exhibits the passing of Stella's fantasy onto Laurel. Laurel gets to live the life that Stella only dreamed of having. Where does this leave the viewer? Well, the viewer remains just that, a viewer, as Stella does. The cinematography in this scene never really invites the audience into the action, lacking suture and leaving the viewer without an assigned perspective, despite how close in the camera gets. The viewer is left to once again refer back to Stella, who the viewer has already identified with due to their both being moviegoers. Both remain spectators, unable to access the fantasy they observe on screen. This leads us to examine the film's final scene, Laurel's wedding, which ties together all that we've discussed thus far. First, let's take a look at the Foster essay again, to consider the role marriage plays in class passing. While it is common for films to end in weddings, Foster notes a trend in films like Stella Dallas, often referred to as maternal melodramas, which use the wedding as something other than just denoting a happy ending. For Laurel to successfully class pass, the total erasure of lineage is required. She was left without a mother, and explicitly states how much she wished her mother could have attended her wedding. This serves as an example of what Foster notes here as the pain and legacy of class passing through the marriage system. That being said, marriage is necessary for Laurel in order to solidify her place in the upper class. We can see here that Laurel's wedding was foreshadowed during the scene at the party. She wears a white gown and is shown in the arms of a man who is similarly styled to the man she ends up marrying. Something to note as well about this shot on the right of Laurel's wedding is how it's framed. The image is obscured by the window frame in the foreground, making it even more evident that the viewer is not part of the action, but just a spectator. Though with this image, for the first time in all the shots we've looked at thus far, the viewer is assigned to a character's perspective, Stella's. Stella watches Laurel's wedding from the outside, obscured by the window frame. Seeing her daughter make her status as a member of the upper class official, something that Stella could never do. Now let's look back at the earlier scene of Stella watching the movie one last time. We can see here how similar these two scenes are. Stella watches her fantasy get played out in both scenes, though things have changed by the end. While at the movies, Stella still has hope that her dream may become a reality, and it did, but not for her. Stella, shown as a spectator at the movies towards the beginning of the film, remains a spectator at the end. Stella's, and therefore the viewer's, status as a spectator is solidified. Both Stella and the viewer are never able to enter their fantasy, or the movie screen. Stella Dallas serves as a reminder to its audience that this can never change. The fantasy will remain just a fantasy. The lights in the theater will come on, and you'll be left right where you started.